Boone County, Nebraska, back in 1873. Everyone around was rushing to get their wooden houses built before the cold weather hit, but not Samuel Harper. This English guy who'd moved to America was still out there digging as September was winding down. He didn't care what people thought. He was carving his home right into the side of a hill facing east. People called him crazy, said he was living like some kind of wild creature, told each other he was making settlers look bad. What he built was simple: 3 walls made of dirt and 1 wall of logs. The roof? He stacked poles, then brush, then hay, and topped it all with dirt packed so thick you could walk across it. He spent weeks on this thing while his neighbors finished their houses in just days. When he was done, all you could see was a chimney pipe sticking out and a door. That's it. Then came January 12th, 1888. Nobody saw it coming. The children's blizzard. The temperature was sitting at 44 degrees at 2 in the afternoon. By the next morning, 42 below zero. That's an 86-degree drop in less than a day. The wooden houses turned into ice boxes. People fed their stoves constantly and still couldn't win against the wind that found every crack. 235 people froze to death. But that buried cabin on the hillside? It stayed 50 degrees warmer than the houses falling apart in town. What did Samuel Harper know about dirt, wind, and heat that everybody else thought was backward thinking? How did his underground home make the difference between being comfortable and dying when the worst blizzard in Plains history tested every building out there? If you like hearing about old wisdom that actually worked, hit that subscribe button. We've got more true stories worth hearing about. Drop your city and time in the comments. We love seeing where these reach. Samuel Harper stepped off the Union Pacific train in Grand Island, Nebraska back in April 1873. He had $47 in his pocket, a canvas bag full of tools, and that practical English stubbornness that looked at American frontier confidence with suspicion. He'd worked with stone and wood back in Yorkshire's hill country, where the wind was serious business and winter killed anyone who wasn't ready. The people selling Nebraska land promised him rich dirt and easy weather. But Harper had read the climate reports from the Army Signal Service weather stations. He knew the Great Plains had temperature swings that would break a man from Yorkshire if he built like he was still back in Leeds. By late May, Harper had claimed his homestead in Boone County, 160 acres of rolling grassland with a creek running through the northeast corner and a decent-sized hill rising up from the southern edge. The land agent processing his papers made it pretty clear that Harper needed to build something that looked like progress. Wooden frame houses were going up fast all over the county. Most of them were simple boxes with board siding, single-layer walls, and stone or brick chimneys you could spot from miles away. The faster you got walls up and a roof on, the sooner you could prove your claim and look like a real American farmer instead of some broke immigrant camping on government property. Harper walked his land for 3 days straight, studying how the hill curved and watching how the wind moved across the open ground. The wind usually came from the northwest, blowing straight across the flat prairie with nothing to slow it down. But the east side of the hill gave natural protection, and the morning sun would warm that slope even in deep winter. He'd seen similar land in the Yorkshire Dales, where old shepherds built stone huts tucked into hillsides that stayed warm with just a small peat fire. The idea was simple: let the earth do the heavy lifting instead of fighting it with thin walls and hoping for the best. When Harper started digging in early June, his closest neighbor, a carpenter named Robert Mitchell, who'd built 4 frame houses that spring, came by to see what the English guy was up to. Mitchell found Harper 20 feet into the hillside, digging out a rectangular room with hand tools and a wheelbarrow. The back wall was clean earth carved straight up and smooth. The side walls angled in slightly for strength. The floor sloped gently toward what would be the front entrance, creating natural drainage to carry any water away from the living area, instead of letting it pool in corners where it could freeze and crack things. Mitchell looked at the hole and shook his head. A man could build a real house in the time Harper was wasting on this hole in the ground. Frame lumber was sitting at the railroad depot in Columbus, 20 miles south. A standard 16 by 20 cabin could be framed, sided, and roofed in 2 weeks if you worked steady and had help with the heavy stuff. Harper's dugout might be quicker to start, but it would never look like anything more than an animal den trying to be something it wasn't. Decent people would think he was too poor or too lazy to build above ground, and when it came time to sell the property or bring in a wife, no woman with any sense would want to live underground like some prairie dog. Harper listened politely and kept digging. He'd worked out the heat dynamics of his situation with the same careful thinking he'd once used on Yorkshire stone walls. A standard frame house in this climate would have 4 walls exposed to wind and weather with barely any insulation and gaps between boards that would leak warm air all winter. When the temperature dropped and the wind picked up, a thin-walled building would lose heat faster than any reasonable fire could replace it. His dugout would have 3 walls of earth, material that stayed at roughly the same temperature all year and blocked wind completely. The only exposed wall would be the front, built with logs sealed tight and positioned to catch morning sunlight while staying protected from the worst winds. By July, word about Harper's project had gotten around the county. Farmers stopping by would find him cutting and fitting logs for the front wall or laying poles across the hole to form the roof structure. The design was straightforward, but thought out. Heavy timber beams going across the width of the dugout with smaller poles laid the other direction to create a solid base. Over the poles went a layer of brush and prairie grass, then a thick layer of clay-rich dirt that would shed water and keep heat in. The finished roof would be strong enough to hold a horse and rider, invisible from more than 100 yards away, and sealed tight enough to keep out wind and rain. The local land agent, a guy from Missouri named Thomas Peterson, who'd sold homestead parcels to 63 families that year, made a point of visiting Harper's claim in late August. Peterson's job depended on bringing in serious settlers who would build real improvements and prove that Boone County was ready for civilization. Dugouts were legal under the homestead laws, but they sent the wrong message to potential buyers and Eastern investors who expected to see signs of permanent development. Peterson suggested that Harper might want to think of the dugout as temporary, while he saved money for a real house that would add value to the area and make him look good. Harper thanked Peterson for his thoughts and kept working on the roof. He mixed clay, grass, and water into a thick paste that would dry hard without cracking, then spread it 6 inches deep over the brush layer. The earth roof would soak up summer heat during the day and let it out slowly at night, keeping temperature swings down in both directions. In winter, snow would add another insulation layer, and the thermal mass of the surrounding earth would protect the inside against the kind of sudden temperature drops that could turn a frame house into a death trap when fuel ran low or wind found gaps in the walls. By September, Harper had moved into his buried cabin. The inside measured 12 by 16 feet, with a 7-foot ceiling and walls that stayed dry even when it rained hard. A small window in the front wall let light in, and the door opened onto a recessed entrance that stayed protected from drifting snow. The whole thing had cost him $11 in materials and 6 weeks of steady work, faster and cheaper than any frame house, and built specifically for plains weather instead of what Eastern building traditions expected. His neighbors called it living like an animal, but Harper was building for January. The first hard freeze showed up in mid-October, dropping temperatures into the teens overnight and coating the prairie grass with frost that crunched under your feet until the sun melted it by mid-morning. Harper woke in his dugout to find the air inside still comfortable enough to get dressed without rushing, while his neighbor Mitchell was already splitting kindling at dawn to get his frame house warm enough for his family to climb out of bed. The difference wasn't huge yet, but you could measure it. And Harper knew the real test was still months out. Wind was the hidden enemy that most plains builders didn't take seriously enough. A calm day at 20 degrees felt manageable, even nice if the sun was shining. But 20 degrees with 30-mile-per-hour wind created conditions that could freeze exposed skin in minutes and drove cold air through every gap in a building like water through a sieve. Frame houses, no matter how carefully built, had hundreds of spots where air could leak, where boards met, where windows fit into frames, where chimneys went through roofs. Each gap was small, but together they created a ventilation system that worked against anyone trying to heat the inside. Harper's dugout got rid of most of these problems by replacing 3 walls with solid earth. The hillside couldn't leak. It couldn't shift in the wind or develop gaps between boards. The earth around his living space stayed at about 55 degrees all year, insulated by depth and weight from the temperature swings that tortured buildings on the surface. When the outside air dropped toward zero, his buried walls were still holding steady at a temperature that felt warm when you touched them. The only surface that could leak heat was the front wall, and Harper had built it with 8-inch logs sealed tight with clay mortar and backed by a layer of sod blocks that closed any remaining openings. The thermal mass idea was something Harper had learned from Yorkshire stone buildings, but it worked even better in plains earth construction. Thermal mass meant that materials with weight and thickness absorbed heat slowly and gave it off slowly, creating a buffer against fast temperature changes. A thin frame wall had almost no thermal mass. It heated up quick and cooled down quick, just following whatever the outside temperature was doing. But tons of earth surrounding Harper's living space had huge thermal mass, storing heat during warm times and releasing it gradually when things turned cold. The math of heating a dugout versus heating a frame house was brutally simple. A standard cabin might have 4 walls, a floor, and a ceiling exposed to outside temperatures, 6 surfaces losing heat constantly. Harper's dugout had only 1 wall, part of a roof, and a small floor area that could lose heat to the outside. Even more important, the temperature difference his small heating stove had to overcome was way smaller. When outside air hit 20 below zero, Mitchell was trying to heat his cabin from 20 below to 70 above, a 90-degree lift. Harper's stove only had to lift the temperature from the earth-buffered 50 degrees to 70, a 20-degree lift that needed less than a quarter of the fuel. Harper had positioned his dugout on the east face of the hill for reasons that became clear once the sun's angle changed in late fall. Morning sunlight hit the front wall directly, adding free solar heating when the building needed it most. The recessed entryway stayed protected from northwest winds that could drive snow sideways across the prairie and create drifts 12 feet deep in a single storm. The roof's earth covering meant that snow didn't slide off onto the ground in front of the door. It stayed put, adding another insulation layer exactly where Harper needed it most. Drainage was the engineering puzzle that separated dugouts that worked from ones that failed. Water was earth construction's worst enemy, and the plains could deliver it in ways that destroyed poorly planned shelters. Spring snowmelt, summer thunderstorms, and winter freeze-thaw cycles all created moisture that had to be directed away from living spaces, or it would make underground homes unlivable. Harper had sloped his floor toward the entrance, cut drainage channels around the edges of the hole, and positioned the structure high enough on the hillside that groundwater would flow past, rather than through his walls. The roof design had 4 separate layers working together to shed water and hold heat. The bottom layer was heavy timber poles going across the width of the dugout, strong enough to carry the weight of everything above. Over the poles went a layer of brush and small branches that created air pockets and kept the upper layers from sifting down into the living space. The third layer was prairie grass and hay packed thick to insulate and create a base for the final covering. The top layer was 6 inches of clay-rich earth mixed with grass to prevent cracking and sloped gently to carry rain and snowmelt away from the structure. By November, Harper's heating routine had settled into a pattern that used less than half the firewood Mitchell burned in his frame house. A small fire in the morning took the chill off and got the thermal mass absorbing heat. The earth walls and roof held that warmth all day, releasing it slowly as outside temperatures dropped. Evening fires were quick and efficient, adding just enough heat to stay comfortable without fighting massive heat loss through exposed surfaces. The dugout stayed consistently warmer than outside, but it also stayed cooler than the peak heat of summer days. The Earth's thermal mass worked both ways, smoothing out temperature swings that made frame houses stifling in July and Arctic in January. Harper could work comfortably inside his buried cabin during weather that had his neighbors huddling around their stoves or looking for whatever shade they could find. As December settled over Boone County, Harper's neighbors started noticing that his chimney put out a thin stream of smoke, while theirs belched thick clouds from stoves running full blast. The English guy's fuel pile stayed steady while theirs shrank every day. His buried cabin showed no frost building up on the windows, while their frame houses developed ice on interior walls within feet of roaring fires. The mockery was starting to sound less sure of itself, but it would take a real crisis to change minds that had already decided dugouts were primitive shelters for people too poor or lazy to build properly above ground. Harper wasn't building for people's approval. He was building for January 12th, 1888, a date that would prove whether his buried cabin was real engineering or just a fancy hole in the ground. The morning of January 12th, 1888, started with weather so mild that kids in Boone County walked to school without heavy coats. The Army Signal Service weather station in nearby Columbus recorded 44 degrees at 2 in the afternoon, warm enough for farmers to work outside in shirt sleeves and for housewives to hang laundry on lines that had been frozen solid for weeks. The sky had a weird quality that experienced plains folks recognized as dangerous, but the temperature felt like an early taste of spring after a winter that had already delivered more than enough brutal cold snaps. Harper spent the warm afternoon splitting firewood behind his dugout, working steady but without the urgency that had pushed his neighbors to attack their fuel piles during the previous month's cold spell. His buried cabin had used so little wood that his winter supply was mostly intact, stacked and seasoned under a canvas shelter that kept it dry while leaving it easy to reach during storms. The earth-sheltered design meant he could be picky about when he burned fuel, heating only when he needed comfort, rather than constantly fighting heat loss through exposed surfaces. By 4 o'clock, the wind had switched from south to northwest and picked up speed, carrying a metallic smell that made horses nervous and sent cattle bunching up in whatever shelter they could find. The temperature started dropping fast enough to feel the change from 1 minute to the next, and the light took on that gray-white color that came before serious weather. Harper finished splitting his afternoon's worth of kindling and carried several armloads inside, stacking them near his small heating stove where they'd stay dry and ready no matter what the night might bring. The blizzard announced itself with a sound that veteran plains settlers would remember for the rest of their lives. A low howl that rose from the northwest horizon like a massive freight train coming closer, along with a wall of white that stretched across the entire sky you could see. Within minutes, the temperature dropped from the 40s into the teens, and the wind speed climbed past 50 miles per hour, driving snow sideways across the prairie with enough force to strip bark from trees and sandblast any exposed surfaces. In town, families who'd enjoyed the afternoon warmth found themselves scrambling to close storm windows and fire up heating stoves that had been running low during the mild spell. The sudden temperature drop caught most households without enough fuel immediately available, and the wind-driven cold started finding every gap in their frame construction. Houses that had felt reasonably tight during calm weather became sieves as the blizzard tested every joint, every window frame, every spot where different materials met and created potential leak points. Robert Mitchell, the carpenter who'd built 4 houses that spring, discovered that his own cabin was losing heat faster than his stove could replace it. The wind found gaps between floorboards and pushed cold air up through the living space, while other drafts came through the walls wherever boards had shrunk or settled since construction. His family gathered around the heating stove, but the area more than 6 feet from the firebox got noticeably cold within the first hour of the storm, and frost started forming on the interior walls where moisture from their breath condensed against surfaces too cold to stop ice from building up. The storm's power exceeded anything the region had seen in recent memory. Wind speeds hit 60 miles per hour, creating whiteout conditions that made it impossible to see beyond a few yards. The temperature kept dropping all evening, hitting 30 below zero by midnight and bottoming out at 42 below just before dawn. The combination of extreme cold and high wind created conditions that overwhelmed heating systems and exposed the fatal weaknesses in buildings that had seemed fine during normal winter weather. Harper's dugout weathered the storm with almost contemptuous ease. The wind that tortured frame houses above ground couldn't get any grip on his earth-sheltered walls. Snow that piled 12 feet deep against exposed buildings just added another insulation layer to his already protected roof. The thermal mass of the surrounding hillside kept absorbing and releasing heat in its slow, steady rhythm, unaffected by the chaos raging across the surface of the prairie. Inside the buried cabin, Harper kept a small fire going that burned less wood in 12 hours than his neighbors used in 2. The earth walls around him held steady at their buffered temperature, while the outside air dropped toward levels that could freeze human skin in minutes. His single exposed wall faced away from the worst wind, and the recessed entryway created a protected zone where snow couldn't pile against the door or create the kind of buildup that trapped families inside poorly designed buildings. The blizzard's victims started showing up before the storm ended. Families in frame houses found their heating systems overwhelmed by the combination of extreme cold and constant air leaking in. Stoves that had seemed good enough during earlier cold spells couldn't keep livable temperatures when wind drove the outside chill through every crack and gap in their buildings. Some households burned furniture when their fuel ran out. Others found that their chimneys couldn't draw properly in the extreme wind, filling their cabins with smoke while failing to give enough heat. Schools that had let children go during the afternoon warmth became death traps when the temperature crashed before students could get home. The Mara Valley Schoolhouse, a frame building typical of rural Nebraska construction, gave minimal protection from conditions that made travel impossible and survival questionable. Teachers and students huddled around inadequate heating stoves while the wind found every weakness in the building and exploited it ruthlessly. By dawn on January 13th, the storm had killed 235 people across the Plains states. Most were caught between inadequate shelters or trapped in buildings that couldn't maintain life-supporting temperatures when tested by genuinely severe conditions. The children's blizzard became a regional turning point that separated book knowledge about plains weather from actual survival ability, and it exposed the difference between buildings that looked civilized and shelters that actually worked when civilization's assumptions failed. Harper came out of his dugout into a transformed landscape where snow had drifted 20 feet deep in some spots, while leaving other areas scraped clean by the wind. His buried cabin had burned less fuel during the worst blizzard in regional memory than most of his neighbors used during an ordinary cold snap, and the inside had never dropped below a temperature that let him sleep comfortably without heavy blankets. The storm had ended, but the real testing had just started. The aftermath of the children's blizzard showed the brutal math of shelter performance under extreme conditions. When Harper went out on the morning of January 13th to check on his neighbors, he found a landscape that demonstrated the difference between theoretical cold weather construction and actual survival engineering. Houses that had looked solid and properly built 3 days earlier now showed signs of thermal failure that would have been invisible during normal winter weather, but became glaringly obvious when tested by 42 below zero and 60-mile-per-hour winds. At the Mitchell place, Harper found a family that had survived the night by burning furniture, books, and anything else they could light on fire inside their frame house. Despite burning nearly a full cord of firewood plus emergency fuel, the interior temperature had never gotten above freezing more than 6 feet from the stove. Ice had formed on the interior walls, where the family's breath condensed against surfaces too cold to prevent frost buildup. The single-wall construction, that seemed fine during mild weather, had become a thermal sieve when wind pressure drove outside air through every gap between boards, around window frames, and through the countless small openings that frontier carpentry left unsealed. Harper's dugout had kept an interior temperature of 68 degrees throughout the storm, while burning less than an eighth of the fuel Mitchell used. The 50-degree difference between the two buildings wasn't about better heating equipment or more fuel. It was pure engineering. The buried cabin's 3 earth walls couldn't leak heat because they were surrounded by thermal mass that stayed at a consistent 55 degrees, regardless of what was happening on the surface. The single exposed wall faced away from the prevailing wind and was protected by the recessed entryway that stopped snow from drifting against the door or creating the kind of buildup that could trap people inside. The temperature gap became even more extreme when Harper visited families whose heating systems had failed completely during the storm. The Peterson household, built by the same carpenter who'd criticized Harper's dugout as primitive, had suffered complete thermal collapse when their stove couldn't draw properly in the extreme wind conditions. The family had survived by pulling back into a single room and sharing body heat under every blanket they owned, but the interior temperature had dropped near zero, a 70-degree difference from the comfortable warmth inside Harper's earth-sheltered cabin. The technical explanation for these performance differences lay in basic heat transfer principles that most frontier builders either didn't understand or chose to ignore for the sake of speed and looks. Heat moved through building materials in 3 ways: conduction through solid surfaces, convection through air movement, and radiation across empty spaces. Frame houses failed because they allowed all 3 forms of heat loss to work simultaneously and catastrophically. Thin walls conducted heat rapidly to the outside. Air leaks created convection currents that carried warm air out and cold air in. Large interior spaces let radiant heat spread out before it could warm the areas where families needed comfort. Harper's dugout controlled all 3 heat loss methods through deliberate design choices his neighbors had dismissed as crude or unnecessary. The earth walls eliminated conductive heat loss through 3/4 of the building because the surrounding soil stayed at a stable temperature all year. The tight construction and protected entrance stopped convective heat loss by getting rid of the air leaks that turned other buildings into wind tunnels during storms. The compact interior space held radiant heat efficiently, with the thermal mass of the earth walls soaking up warmth during heating periods and giving it back slowly when the fire burned low. The fuel consumption comparison gave the clearest measure of each shelter's thermal efficiency. Mitchell had burned through 4 days' worth of normal winter fuel during the single night of the blizzard, plus furniture and other emergency stuff, while getting interior temperatures that barely supported survival. Harper had used less wood than he normally burned during a mild winter evening, while keeping comfortable living conditions throughout the crisis. The math was stark. His buried cabin needed roughly 1/10 the energy input to get far better thermal performance. The storm had also shown critical differences in structural strength that only became clear under extreme wind loading. Frame houses throughout the county showed signs of stress where constant pressure from 60-mile-per-hour gusts had found weak spots in their construction. Roof panels had lifted, siding had loosened, and foundation settling had opened gaps that would plague these buildings for years. The dugout's earth-covered roof had actually gotten stronger under the storm's assault as the weight of piled-up snow compressed the soil layers into an even better thermal barrier. Water management, the engineering challenge Harper had addressed through careful drainage design, proved crucial during the blizzard's aftermath. Melting snow and ice created runoff that got into poorly positioned buildings, while his hillside placement and sloped hole directed moisture safely away from the living space. Several frame houses in lower areas suffered flood damage when snowmelt found its way through compromised foundations, creating interior moisture problems that would last long after the temperature returned to normal levels. The storm had created a controlled experiment in shelter design, with identical weather conditions testing every building in the county at the same time. The results were measurable and undeniable. Earth-sheltered construction outperformed conventional frame building by margins so wide they couldn't be blamed on luck, better materials, or superior craftsmanship. The dugout had simply been engineered for the conditions it would face, while the frame houses had been built for the conditions their owners hoped they'd face. Word of Harper's thermal success spread through the county faster than news of the storm's deaths. Families who'd barely survived the blizzard in their conventional houses started asking detailed questions about dugout construction techniques, site selection, and thermal performance. The mockery that had greeted Harper's buried cabin 15 months earlier gave way to respectful curiosity about engineering principles that had proven themselves under the most extreme test the plains could deliver. The carpenter Mitchell, whose own house had nearly killed his family during the storm, showed up at Harper's door 3 days after the blizzard ended. He brought a notebook and a measuring tape, ready to learn construction techniques he'd dismissed as primitive when they challenged his assumptions about proper frontier building. The conversation that followed would change how buildings were constructed throughout Boone County for the next generation. But it started with a simple admission. Harper had been right about the relationship between earth, wind, and human survival on the Great Plains. The transformation of Boone County's building practices started quietly in the weeks after the children's blizzard, as families whose frame houses had nearly killed them during the storm began asking Harper practical questions about earth-sheltered construction. The conversations weren't dramatic or ceremonial, just neighbors stopping by to look at his dugout's design details and ask about site selection, drainage techniques, and thermal performance under extreme conditions. Harper answered their questions with the same careful precision he'd used on the original construction, explaining principles rather than pushing a particular building style. Robert Mitchell arrived with his notebook on a gray February morning, ready to document construction techniques he'd dismissed 15 months earlier as beneath proper settlement standards. Harper walked him through the excavation process, explaining why the east-facing direction caught morning sunlight while protecting the entrance from prevailing winds. He showed the drainage slope that directed moisture away from the living space, and demonstrated how the layered roof construction shed water while providing thermal insulation. Mitchell took careful notes on timber sizing, hole dimensions, and the clay mortar recipe that sealed gaps between logs in the exposed front wall. The dugout's thermal performance data became the foundation for a new approach to plains construction that borrowed earth-sheltering principles without requiring families to live entirely underground. Mitchell designed hybrid buildings that used earth berming around conventional frame walls, reducing the exposed surface area that could lose heat during extreme weather. Other builders experimented with earth-covered roofs that gave better insulation compared to standard shingle construction, while still keeping the appearance of conventional houses that satisfied social expectations about proper frontier homes. Harper's influence spread through hands-on demonstration rather than preaching. He welcomed visitors who wanted to examine his construction techniques, but never promoted dugout living as better than other building methods. The buried cabin had solved his specific problems: scarce timber, limited money, and the need for reliable thermal performance during severe weather. But he understood that other settlers faced different limits and priorities. His contribution was technical knowledge that could be adapted to various construction approaches rather than one universal housing solution. The Nebraska State Historical Society would eventually document Harper's story as part of their frontier housing collection, noting that his dugout represented a successful adaptation of traditional earth-sheltering techniques to Great Plains conditions. The memoir he wrote in his 70s described the children's blizzard as a regional teacher that exposed the difference between building for looks and building for performance. His account emphasized practical lessons rather than personal vindication, focusing on construction techniques that had proven reliable under extreme stress. By 1890, earth-bermed construction had become common throughout Boone County, with more than 40 buildings incorporating some form of earth protection for thermal efficiency. The hybrid approach satisfied both practical and social needs, giving improved cold weather performance while keeping the visual characteristics that marked a settlement as civilized and permanent. These buildings survived later severe weather events with fuel consumption and interior temperature performance that approached Harper's original dugout specs. The broader engineering principles Harper had demonstrated found uses beyond home construction. County schools adopted earth berming and improved insulation standards after the Mira Valley schoolhouse tragedy highlighted the deadly consequences of inadequate thermal design. Commercial buildings in Columbus and other regional centers started incorporating earth protection and thermal mass elements that cut heating costs while providing more stable interior conditions during extreme weather events. Harper's dugout became a reference point for a generation of plains builders who understood that successful frontier construction required adaptation to local climate conditions rather than blind following of Eastern building traditions. The earth-sheltered design principles he'd proven during the 1888 blizzard influenced construction techniques throughout the region for decades, creating a distinctive Great Plains architectural tradition that put thermal performance ahead of conventional appearance standards. The legacy extended beyond building techniques to include a broader understanding of environmental adaptation that shaped how plains communities approached infrastructure development. Harper's success with earth sheltering encouraged similar experiments with wind protection, water management, and resource conservation that helped transform the Great Plains from a region where survival was questionable into an area where sustainable settlement became possible for families with modest resources and practical building skills. Modern earth-sheltered construction continues to validate the principles Harper applied to his Boone County dugout, with contemporary builders using advanced materials and techniques to achieve the same fundamental goals: thermal efficiency and weather resistance. Current energy-efficient building standards recognize earth contact and thermal mass as critical design elements for cold climate construction, vindicating approaches that frontier builders developed through necessity and refined through experience with extreme weather events. Harper lived in his dugout for 37 years, eventually adding a frame addition for guests and storage while keeping the original earth-sheltered core as his main living space. Visitors to his homestead in the early 1900s found a comfortable, well-appointed home that showed how earth-sheltered construction could provide both practical performance and dignified living conditions. His fuel consumption stayed remarkably low throughout his time there, and the structure showed no signs of falling apart, despite decades of exposure to plains weather extremes. The Children's Blizzard of 1888 became a benchmark event that separated book knowledge about cold weather construction from demonstrated survival capacity under genuinely extreme conditions. Harper's dugout hadn't merely survived the test. It had performed so effectively that it established new standards for thermal efficiency and weather resistance that influenced plains construction practices for generations. The buried cabin that neighbors had mocked as primitive proved to be advanced engineering that understood the relationship between earth, wind, and human survival better than the conventional building wisdom of its time. When Harper died in 1923, his obituary in the Columbus newspaper noted his role in developing earth-sheltered construction techniques that had saved lives and resources throughout the region. The dugout remained structurally sound and thermally efficient, a testament to engineering principles that had been proven correct by the harshest conditions the Great Plains could deliver.